Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Acting Deputy President. I seek leave to take note of the report into the Environment and Communications Legislation Committee, Landholders' Right to Refuse Gas and Coal Bill of 2015, and the report into that legislation. Now, this is legislation that we Greens have introduced, not once, not twice, but 3 times now into this federal parliament over the last 4 years. And in that time, of course, we've seen growing community concern at the scientific impacts and at the health and community and climate impacts of this new rapacious fossil fuel industry, which is coal seam gas, shale gas and tight gas, or unconventional gases as the overarching term. Now, we are seeking to give landholders the right to refuse access to coal mining companies and unconventional gas companies who come knocking at all hours of the day and night. And of course, currently landholders cannot say no. There is no legal right for them to refuse entry or access to their land, for it then to be turned into an open-cut coal mine or to be hydrologically fracked, hydraulically fracked, or fracking as it's known for clear, evident reasons. And they have absolutely no right to determine that they in fact want to keep farming this beautiful land. And in Queensland, we've seen the coal seam gas industry roll out on some of our best food-producing land and some of our best soils, which sadly we have too little of. So it was with that community sentiment and the scientific concern in mind that we once again introduced this private members bill to empower landholders to protect their land and water, to enable them to continue to produce the food that we are currently a net food exporter of, and of course to continue to address climate change given the huge fugitive emissions from unconventional gas, and of course given the direct climate impacts of coal mining. Now, in the course of this inquiry, we heard some incredibly powerful evidence, and I want to take the opportunity to thank deeply all of the communities who took the time to both make submissions and to give us evidence in the hearings. It was a deeply emotional experience for many of these community members who've had their lives and their land overrun, and who in many instances have suffered personal family health impacts. And I'd like to take the opportunity to just read into the record some of the evidence that some very passionate community members made on that topic. We heard from Shay Dougal and Narelle Northdurft from the Hopeland Community Sustainability Group, and I quote, "Narelle's family have got documented problems with eyes, nose and throat. They have problems with chronic headaches and migraines." And she says, "My 7-year-old boy has been suffering fast onsetting headaches for a few years now. They're so severe he bangs his head into the wall on the floor, or the floor, anything to make them stop." Now, we heard some evidence that there'd been some studies recommended by the Queensland Department of Health to be done into air quality, and that those studies were discontinued for no apparent discernible reason, and the studies were not in fact then carried out, and 2 years later those residents are still waiting to find out what sadly they already know from their daily experience, that their family's health is being threatened by this new industry. Now, of course, we heard some very serious evidence from the CSIRO and from the Department of Environment, who confirmed that in their studies into hydraulic fracturing, that in fact they've not even started to look at the impacts on deep aquifers from fracking. And they also acknowledged that that meant that they hadn't looked at the risks of mobilising naturally occurring carcinogens in the geology, which of course occurs in the fracking process. So they've said those studies are in fact in their infancy, and we also heard that in fact there's been several jurisdictions, not just domestically, some of the states have, in recognition of the scientific dangers, place moratoria on fracking in their states. That's Victoria, Tasmania and sorry, my apologies, just Victoria and Tasmania at the minute. But of course, internationally, there's many jurisdictions that have said fracking is too risky for our communities and our land. We've got Canada, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. In Europe, there's Germany, there's Wales, Scotland, France, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, and many states of the USA. So we're hearing more and more about the potential dangers of this process, and yet we also heard in the course of the inquiry that the big parties don't wish to do anything about it. I found it somewhat well, incredibly disappointing would be understating it, that the report into this bill does in fact acknowledge that there are problems, but then proceeds to recommend doing absolutely nothing about those identified problems. In effect, it's a statement that says, this is not our problem, let's leave it up to the state governments, they're doing a perfectly fine job. Well, clearly they're not doing a perfectly fine job, and we heard evidence from many legal groups saying the regulation of this industry is utterly woeful, that there are multiple breaches of permits, that there is a real risk to land and water from this new fossil fuel rapacious industry, and that in fact national leadership is what is required. National leadership to at least put a moratoria on fracking until we better understand the kind of experiment that we're wreaking onto communities. And in the Greens' view, that evidence is already clear enough and it should be a ban. Now, coming back to the key aspect of the bill, which is to allow landholders to say no to large coal mines and unconventional gas and fracking on their land, it was really quite duplicitous, I thought, to hear from industry saying, oh, but look at how many voluntary agreements the community signed. They must be so happy with this arrangement. They've signed up to these agreements. Well, they have no choice to sign. They have no legal right not to sign, and that was made patently clear simply from the common sense of it, but by some of the excellent witnesses who said, who talked about this imbalance of bargaining power. Drew Hutton from Lock the Gate, who of course should be acknowledged as the father of that movement, who's done just fantastic work in unifying communities and giving them a voice and some courage to speak out against this David and Goliath battle between the very wealthy multinational fossil fuel companies and the farming and community groups who've sadly been forgotten about by many folk in this place. Drew Hutton said, the first assumption is that there's some sort of equality in the negotiation that goes on between mining companies and farmers. In fact, as far as we're concerned, there is no equality. It's negotiation with a gun at the head of the landowner. Rosemary Nankerville from the SOS Liverpool Plains group said, the bill uses the term agreement. I can tell you unequivocally that when dealing with a resource company, there is no such thing as an agreement. In some cases, perhaps a painful type of coexistence results, but it is the farming community that does the giving. And Kirsty Kelly from People for the Plains said, all the power lies with the coal and gas companies. The landholders' only position is to accept or go to legal challenge. There's much discussion about coexistence between coal and gas and agriculture, but how can you have coexistence when all the power lies with one party? And of course the legal challenge that she's referring to there is not the ability to say no, it's just to quibble over the price of access. So it was with great disappointment that despite the excellent evidence given in the course of the inquiry into this bill, that both of the big parties said, not our problem, we're not going to do a thing about this, let's leave it up to the state governments. Yes, there seems to be some problem here, but it's not our responsibility to deal with it. Well, we think that this does need a national approach. Clearly, the vested interests in the coal mining companies and the unconventional gas companies, who make some generous donations to the political parties in this place, they have been writing the agenda and writing their own rules for far too long. It's about time that the community had a fair go and had their rights to clean air and clean water and health protected. And if we are to truly tackle climate change, then this notion that unconventional gas somehow burns cleaner than coal just needs to be debunked. When you factor in the leaking gas that I have seen and heard with my own eyes and ears on various visits to these places around the country, when you factor in those fugitive emissions, this stuff is just as dirty as coal. It is no solution to climate change. And clearly it is not worth the risk to the health and the longevity of our farmland and our farming communities. So I commend the bill to this place. I do not commend the report, but in fact I commend the dissenting report, and I urge all members of this place to speak to their communities about this issue. You'll find there's a real growing community concern. People want their land and their water and their communities protected, and they want their voice back. They're sick of being not heard and their needs coming last as opposed to the big fossil fuel companies. So I'm really pleased to have been able to give those communities a voice in the course of this hearing, and we will not give up on this fight.